Greetings, everyone. I am Donrich Thaldar, and on behalf of the School of Law, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I bid you all welcome to this online colloquium on the topic of human heritable genome editing. I would like to thank our partner, the Genetics and Bioethics Network of the International Association of Bioethics, for their wonderful support in organizing this colloquium. We are privileged to have a panel of 4 illustrious speakers. During the first half of today's colloquium, our panel of speakers will share their insights with us. Then, during the second half of the colloquium, we will be inviting comments and questions from all participants. We are recording this colloquium and we will make it available on our website afterwards. Just as a matter of protocol, may I please ask everybody to keep their microphones on mute. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Bonginkosi Shozi, who is a doctoral fellow at the School of Law of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I can add that Mr. Shozi has just recently submitted his doctoral thesis and is now awaiting his examination results. So over to you, Mr. Shozi.
Thank you, Donrich, and thank you to everyone who's in attendance this morning. I trust you can all hear me very well. I have the unenviable task of being the first of many brilliant speakers today, and I hope to introduce you all to a particular topic or a series of ideas that I think is of interest to everyone here, hopefully, and ideas that I hope my fellow speakers will also expand upon. I think this colloquium is a very rare opportunity for us to discuss topics at the intersect of 2 very different, well, seemingly very different areas, that being African philosophy and gene editing. And my specific talk will focus on germline genome editing and some of the ethical, legal, and human rights issues that are raised by gene editing and how African philosophy can potentially provide useful new perspectives on some of these issues. Just as a preface, this talk is going to be based on a paper that has been published for a few months now. So if some of you have read this paper, you might know some of what I'm going to say, but I will try and expand on some of these ideas to at least make it interesting for all of you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, Bongi.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out how to begin the slideshow. My screen appears to be frozen. Sorry for the delay, everyone.
No worries, just give it some time.
There you go.
Perfect.
Okay, so as you all can see, my name is Bonginkosi Shozi. I'm a doctoral fellow at the African Health Research flagship group at UKZN School of Law, and the topic of my presentation is going to be, does human germline genome editing violate human dignity? And I'll be approaching this question from an African perspective on the human rights issues raised by genome editing, and not only for present persons, but also people who might exist in the future. So this talk, just to give an overview, is going to have 4 general parts or themes that I'm going to be looking at. First and foremost is a question that's central to the question posed at the beginning of this particular presentation. That is, what exactly is human dignity and why does it matter for human heritable genome editing? The second question, the second section is going to concern 2 very different concepts of human dignity and how those particular concepts have an impact on how we interpret the concept and how we think it should be applied. The third part is going to be looking at the issue of human dignity through the lens of the African philosophical concept of Ubuntu. And then the fourth part is going to be looking at what this Ubuntu perspective can say on the question of heritable human genome editing and its intergenerational effects. Now, in order to preface this entire talk, I thought it was important to answer the all-important why question, which is, why is the question of human dignity one that's even important to answer? Well, this particular presentation, this discussion of human dignity and how it impacts heritable genome editing is occasioned by the fact that in the global discussion that's been happening about genome editing, particularly since the advent of CRISPR in 2012, there have been a number of individuals who have made various versions of the claim that gene editing and the use of genetic technologies in general is a violation of human dignity. Now, this is a very strong claim for a number of reasons, most notably because human dignity is a very powerful concept. It's very rhetorically compelling. And when individuals rely on human dignity, those arguments tend to be persuasive because of the weight that human dignity has as both an ethical concept and as a legal concept to illustrate several states have in their constitutions, which is generally considered to be the highest law, provisions that regard human dignity as a foundational human right. And so if we're going to say that human dignity is violated by gene editing, well, that's a major claim because it leads to the conclusion that any state that takes human dignity seriously has no option but to prohibit the use of technologies like CRISPR-Cas9 for the purposes of genome editing. If we look at human dignity from an ethical perspective, firstly, we can generally divide claims that human dignity is impacted on or violated by gene editing into two different arguments. The first has to do with the idea that prospective children have a right to what some have described as a unique genetic identity. And this particular genetic identity can be violated by germline gene editing. It's important to note that in speaking of human dignity in these particular terms, we are assuming, in a sense, that the particular child who's born as a result of the use of these technologies has a right to human dignity, and that right to human dignity is linked to their genetic identity. And therefore, insofar as we affect that genetic identity, we violate human dignity. So there's certain, we'll say, claims about the relationship between an individual's genome and their human dignity. It's an important point that we'll come back to a bit later. The second group of arguments is that germline gene editing itself is an act contrary to human dignity. It violates human dignity. Most famous example of this, I think, is by philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who argues that for prospective parents to use a technology like CRISPR is to, quote, treat the desirable genetic traits of their descendants as a product they can shape according to their own liking. So the idea is that not necessarily that the particular child's right to human dignity is violated, but rather the act of gene editing is a violation of human dignity itself. Now, again, there's sort of various normative assumptions underlying that, basically that there is this singular idea of what is human dignity, and that the act of gene editing violates what we believe to be aligned with human dignity. Whether or not you agree with that is, however, something that is at the very least open to argument. And many people have strongly countered arguments such as the ones that I've included here. For example, in response to the claim that the dignity of prospective children is violated by gene editing, certain scholars have argued that, well, at the time at which gene editing is done, there isn't a child that exists yet. And so to say that their human dignity is violated by an act that occurs before they exist is problematic. On the case of gene editing being contrary to human dignity in and of itself, there have been arguments that, well, there's no universal agreement on what human dignity is necessarily and what it stands for. And in light of that, it's difficult to say that gene editing is necessarily opposed to it. From a legal perspective, if we look at human dignity, there's two particular instruments that I would like to refer to because they're the closest we have to an international law position on genetic technologies generally, and by extension, germline genome editing. I do, however, need to make the important qualification that these instruments by no means say definitively whether gene editing is legal from the perspective of international law. That's something we simply don't have an answer on. However, these instruments in their own respects are persuasive on the policies that many countries have taken, and therefore it's important to look at them when trying to take an international or global view on the law relating to gene editing. The first is the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights, which contains a provision that says that practices which are contrary to human dignity, such as the reproductive cloning of human beings, shall not be permitted. This is, as one can observe, a very vague statement because it's not exactly clear what constitutes practices that are contrary to human dignity, except the example of the cloning of human beings. Now, that is a process that requires the use of genetic technologies. So one might argue that genetic technologies generally, or things that involve manipulation of the human genome, are contrary to human dignity. And indeed, many people have interpreted this provision in that way. The Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights is, however, not a binding instrument. And so even states that are party to this particular declaration are not bound to follow it, although some have. Another instrument to consider is a EU law known as the Oviedo Convention. The full name is a bit of a mouthful, so I won't go into that. It's not directly relevant. But what is relevant is this particular provision, which provides that an intervention seeking to modify the human genome may only be undertaken for preventative, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes, and only if its aim is not to introduce any modification in the genome of any descendants. This is ostensibly not based on any particular normative position on these technologies, at least not in the text. But if one considers things more broadly, such as the position that is generally taken on issues relating to human dignity in the EU, it seems that this is based on a similar understanding as the previous instrument, namely that things like gene editing are contrary to human dignity. This is a position that I argue is evident if you look at the comments by the European Parliament on the use of genetic technologies in humans in the context of the debates about cloning human beings that was instigated by the first cloned mammal, Dolly the sheep. The relevant provision provides that the use of genetic technologies in humans permits a eugenic and racist selection of the human race. It offends human dignity. So clearly underlying these statements is a particular idea about what it is to be human and what are morally correct actions. And that insofar as these technologies go against that, they are a violation of human dignity. Now, to return to the question of what exactly human dignity is, it's important to make a few initial comments about its historical development, particularly as a legal concept that informs how we've gotten to the point we've gotten to now, where human dignity is such a dominant concept. Firstly, human dignity is often traced to the Roman concept of dignitas hominis, which was a legal concept and a social concept in Roman times that referred to the dignity of men of high station. So it was only the case that a person who had particular notorious events in their history and therefore a heightened social standing that would be said to have this idea of dignitas hominis. That idea was a seed that was disseminated, and the concept began to take on a more general use, where it was in classical Roman writings used to relate to the moral standing of all men. It was this idea that all of us have a special social standing by virtue of being human beings. And that idea was contained in the concept of dignitas, which became a legal concept and developed over years. And in countries that rely on Roman law, there are particular references to, for example, offenses that are considered offensive because they violate this idea of dignitas. Now, in what's generally called the International Bill of Rights, the use of human dignity became particularly pronounced because it was used in a particular position in the preamble of many notable rights instruments like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and other similar instruments. And they all contain this particular sentence, which is that the inherent dignity of all human persons is what human rights emanate from. And so this is perhaps the earliest and most noteworthy example of human dignity being used as containing the collective weight of all of the rights that human beings are said to have by virtue of being human. And that accounts to a large extent for why human dignity is such a rhetorically compelling idea and why it's taken so seriously, because it's seen as really the crux or the essence of all of the rights that we have as human beings. Unfortunately, in all these uses, in these various international human rights instruments, no definition features in it. But if we look at the original text that preceded the final edition, we get a clue of what the writers perhaps intended to communicate here. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights particularly, the term inherent dignity or human dignity was used as shorthand for, quote, the sanctity and ultimate value of human personality. In other words, the normative value of humanity generally. And so you can see that from its genesis as a legal concept, human dignity has always been associated with an ethical or moral idea, which is that human beings matter. And as a result of what makes human beings matter, they have this thing called human dignity, which is the genesis of all the rights that they have as human beings. And it is important to make this point because it precedes some of the later discussions that we need to then have about how we understand the meaning of human dignity, because clearly there's a moral underpinning behind what's become a legal concept. And so if we're all on the same page about what that moral underpinning is, then we can possibly all agree on what human dignity is as a concept. But if we don't, then we might reasonably disagree on how human dignity functions in practice with specific cases, like the example of gene editing. Now, I alluded to earlier that human dignity often goes undefined, and there's a very specific reason for that in my experience, and that's the idea that if we don't commit to a particular interpretation or version of it, well, then it leads human dignity to become something that's a bit more liberal and free and open to interpretation. And that's generally what we see in post-war constitutionalism, which is that human dignity goes undefined and it's used in a sort of what I call a normatively compelling way, but conceptually its interpretation is indeterminate. It's often open to however an individual feels. But within that context, scholars Derek Bielefeld and Roger Brownsword observe two main trends in how human dignity is used, namely as empowerment and as constraints. Human dignity as empowerment is observed in the number of human rights documents that recognize individuals as having a certain moral weight by virtue of being human. And that particular moral weight is contained in the term human dignity. For example, the UDHR, which we previously referenced. The other version of human dignity we often see as human dignity used as a constraint in provisions where human dignity is referred to not as a quality possessed by a singular person, but rather as humans as a group. And as a result of that collective dignity and as members of the human family, we have to uphold that particular collective human dignity. Now, there's, of course, a potential for conflict here, because while human dignity as an empowerment tends to promote the freedoms of individuals to undertake particular actions, human dignity as a constraint often limits what people can do and is often used as a justification to prescribe the freedom of individuals. An example of this can be observed in South Africa, where there's a rich history of case law that associates this idea of human dignity and the inherent moral worth of persons with the freedom of the individual to act as they wish. And I've given some case law that is an example of that. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into it here. And then we have other case law that talks about how human dignity has been used as a justification for limiting individuals' freedoms. And I wanted to look at a very particular example that highlights where this conflict can exist. And that's in the case of S versus Jordan, in which the Constitutional Court made certain comments on the criminalization of sex work. And essentially the court's reasoning here was that sex work is something that is contrary to human dignity because the human body is not something merely biological. it is not something to be, as the court says, commodified. And therefore, by sex workers engaging in sex work, they're commodifying their bodies and therefore violating human dignity, rather than their choice to make use of their bodies in this way being, an expression of their human dignity. That particular outcome is something that was motivated by a particular moral understanding of individuals, particularly the idea made famous by philosopher Immanuel Kant, this idea that human beings are not mere means to an end, but are always to be ends in and of themselves. It seems the Constitutional Court in this case took that particular understanding of what morality means and the moral way to be ascribed to human persons in interpreting human dignity and using it as a constraint on human behavior. And in cases where human dignity is used as a constraint, in often cases, one observes this idea that human dignity is used in an extra-personal sense, by which I mean, as I gave with the examples in the beginning, that we're not talking about an individual's human dignity being violated, but rather the idea of human dignity itself. And this can be problematic because if human dignity is not tied to a particular person, the range of things it can limit is somewhat arbitrary, as we've seen in certain cases, for example, in the European Court of Justice, where courts have heard that something many people consider mundane, laser tag, is a violation of human dignity. There's the famous French case in which the highest court in the country held that women freely expressing their religion by wearing full head coverings or burqas are violating human dignity by prescribing to a religion that forces them to hide their faces. And so human dignity can really become an enemy of freedom when used in this extra-personal sense. A similar phenomenon we see in the kinds of arguments that I alluded to earlier that claim that human dignity is violated by gene editing. It's not necessarily, in many cases, the claim that a person in particular will be harmed, but rather that human dignity, as some people understand it, will be violated. But the essential problem here, as one I alluded to earlier, is that we don't all agree on the moral underpinnings of human personhood and personality. And therefore, some people might reasonably disagree that gene editing is a violation of human dignity. And that's sort of where we get to African philosophy, because the discussion that I've just had about human dignity and how it's tied to especially the human genome is something that is often happened in a Eurocentric setting. But how might this play out in a non-Western setting? Well, I, in this paper, looked specifically on African philosophy, and specifically the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which is the predominant ethical philosophy of African persons in sub-Saharan Africa, which loosely translates into this idea of humanness. And Ubuntu is popular because it's observed in the languages and in the expressions of many of the African cultures in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's where it sort of gets its legitimacy from. Now, Ubuntu, as I understand it, and as others do, is a virtue ethic in that it requires their people who prescribe to Ubuntu to sort of become a proper person or become a proper human being, not only by being a person biologically, but by engaging in acts and engaging in conducts in the context of a community that embodies the values of what a person in a community ought to do. And it is that communitarian philosophy and that commitment to one's community that makes Ubuntu as an ethic unique. And so personhood in that context is not a static property one has by virtue of being conceived or being born, but rather it's an ontological journey that one goes on as a member of a community. And as I've alluded to, it has two core tenets. That is this idea that personhood is essentially a journey of self-realization that one goes upon by acting in a morally upright way. And it's also something that can only occur in community with other persons. So how does this connect to the issue of human dignity and gene editing? Well, if we look at it from the African communitarian perspective, personhood is something that emerges not just from a particular capacity, but from the act of engaging with one's fellow man. And because of that, personhood must be actualized. This gives us a reason to depart from the idea of a particular genetic composition being the basis of a person's status as a human person or a morally relevant human person at least. And that's important because that idea, often termed genetic determinism, is what underlies statements like what we see in the Oviedo Convention that associates human dignity with the human genome, and therefore interferences with the human genome or violations of the human dignity. All of this to say is that if we look at personhood and at human dignity by extension from an African communitarian perspective, there's a convincing argument to be made that the human genome is of little consequence, and provided that a particular genetic alteration doesn't interfere with the capacity of a person to interface with their community, then gene editing doesn't violate human dignity. And that's a more nuanced position than one might take compared to the other normative perspectives of human dignity that I alluded to earlier. Now, how does this play out for future generations? Well, if we look at Ubuntu as a philosophy and the community that one engages with, Ubuntu often doesn't look at the community as just those people who now exist, but also as the revered ancestors, as well as future generations. This I compare to a comment by African philosopher Murove, who argues that an ethical act worthy of approval is thus one that preserves and incorporates the past into the present with the aim of providing the same memory for future generations. Essentially, what this conveys is that individuals have a duty to act with Ubuntu, not only to those that exist now, but those who will exist in the future, and therefore to do something that is contrary to Ubuntu to a person that doesn't yet exist, for example, by intentionally wanting to use gene editing to create a particular trait that would be harmful and cause suffering to the future person, from the perspective of this ethic, would be a violation of the moral duty on individuals to act with Ubuntu towards future generations. This is adjacent to and provides sort of a conceptual foundation for an idea that I've argued for elsewhere, namely a principle of procreative non-maleficence. And I'd love to go into more detail with it. I've mentioned an article there in which myself and Professor Daldor talk about procreative non-maleficence more generally. But what it essentially boils down to is this idea that while gene editing generally might be permissible, it's definitely limited to particular edits that wouldn't amount to harm to the prospective person. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Shorzy. It's now time for our second presenter, namely Dr. Mariki Botha. Mariki started her career as an attorney in South Africa, specializing in health law and biotechnology. But then about 2 years ago, she transitioned to academia, focusing on interdisciplinary research at the intersection between science, technology, and the law. Mariki is currently a researcher at the Center for Security, Reliability, Security, and Trust at the University of Luxembourg. Her work focuses on the redesign of a legal and ethical digital consent model for long-term genomic data storage and future use. Dr. Botha, we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words. I'm going to try to share my screen. If you can give me a moment. Great. Can everyone see my screen? Everything is fine?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Perfect. Very good. Okay, so thank you for the kind introduction. I started my academic career in Professor Thaldar's research group, and I've learned a lot. And Bongi, thank you for the introduction to human dignity. I would love to build in my presentation today further on that aspect. So you may ask yourself that why or what is someone from Luxembourg doing in an African philosophy colloquium on gene editing? So I'm also an African, born and bred in South Africa, lived there for 44 years, and thank you to closed borders and COVID, my family is still stuck in South Africa. So hopefully vaccinations will speed up and we will be reunited soon. So my African philosophy is that my dad is German and my mom is French. And I'm the 8th generation combined German and French in South Africa. My forefather, Johann Jost Steinberg, landed in Cape of Good Hope in 1748 from Nieder-Ola in south of Germany via Texel in the harbor of Netherlands. So this is my heritage. From there, my forefathers incorporated into the voortrekkers that took the Great Track into the interior parts of South Africa. And if you roughly translate voortrekkers into English, it roughly translates into forward pullers. It's a very ugly word, but it is what it is. So they were the pioneers who headed north into the country, not knowing what they would encounter. So I consider them to be explorers, discoverers, pioneers. So these are my forefathers, and I can, I feel the same with regards to gene editing as a legal scholar and as a bioethicist, with regards to be a pioneer, to explore and to ask the questions, what if? And I want to frame my presentation today within this context of asking what if and playing a little devil's advocate of what could be or what could happen in the future. So let's have a look at the current burden of disease in the context of HIV and TB in South Africa. South Africa contributes to 87% of worldwide TB incidents, which is quite a dramatic number. South Africa also ranked 14th amongst countries with the highest burden of TB and combination of TB, HIV, as well as drug-resistant TB. And in the first national TB prevalence survey of South Africa, which is dated 2018, but was only published earlier this year in 2021, they found that the TB epidemic in South Africa was primarily driven by socio-economic status of people. And primary transmissions was still a major driver. What is, however, of concern is that 66% of survey participants did not seek care for symptoms. And they offered the excuse of, or the valid excuse of lack of funds, of transport, of traveling distances, of clinics, etc., etc. So this is the current situation of TB in South Africa. If we move towards the HIV, the total number of persons currently living, or in 2018, according to the statistics of South Africa, living with HIV is more than 7 million people. That constitutes 13.1% of South Africans' total population. South Africa had also the highest number of people afflicted with HIV of any country, according to 2019 statistics from the United Nations. And what is even more scary for me in respect of HIV/AIDS is that it was as recently as our generation, in 1983, that AIDS was diagnosed for the first time in South Africa. We're not even a generation or two further, and the numbers has escalated out of control. So it's easy to see the seriousness of the burden of disease when it comes to TB and HIV. And the sad thing is that these numbers increase year after year. Now, what are the conditions these people live in? There is a brilliant Netflix documentary called Bending the Arc, where medical practitioners, Dr. Paul Farmer and Jim Kim, they both met at Harvard Medical School, made quality healthcare available to those in poor countries. And if you watch the documentary, you will see the conditions in which these people live, the conditions in which they travel to healthcare, try to access healthcare, the conditions in which they need to take TB medication and how hard it is to stick to a regime of TB medication. And the fights for economic support these people have. But miraculously, they ended up with brilliant results in very, very poor communities, many of those communities resembling some of the poorest communities also in South Africa. So what they've learned is they realize that there's a need to incorporate more community work, such as cultural sensitivity, pointed listening skills, local partnerships, home visits, and all of this dramatically increased the treatment that were given to the people, including multi-drug resistant TB, which was previously thought to be untreatable. But the downside is that you can see that it requires tremendous hours, energy, human resources, etc., to impact the lives of a very small community of people. It's possible, but it's very labor intensive. So from the perspective of gene editing, I've thought that gene editing, or HHGE, human heritable genomic editing, may proffer some form of vaccination that may overcome this problem. So let's have a look at the science first. Always come back to the science. So, and whether it's possible to offer a vaccine or a cure in respect of HIV and TB. So we all know that the Chinese scientist He Jiankui edited the genes of twin baby girls prior to their birth to make them immune to HIV. Unfortunately, he's currently serving prison time and there's no published research results. So we don't know what the effectiveness in humans in this respect is. It would have been brilliant if the court ordered him to actually publish results, but that's a side issue. Since the discovery of HIV/AIDS almost 5 or 4 decades ago, more than 35.3 million people worldwide is affected. ART treatment failed to eradicate this, partially due to the persistence of viral reservoirs. But came along Cas9 technology, which showed promising efficacy in disrupting the HIV genome in latently infected cells and suppressing viral gene expression and replication, and thereby immunizing uninfected cells against HIV-1. That was according to a paper by WHO in 2014. So it seems like gene editing may provide a viable path towards a permanent cure for AIDS and provides a means, in this quote, vaccines against other pathogenic viruses, unquote. So this versatile gene editing tool, CRISPR-Cas9, has been successfully applied to HIV/AIDS prevention and reduction in human cells and in animal models, according to a 2019 model by Tial. I don't know how to pronounce that. And this is in respect of HIV. But in respect of TB, a very exciting paper was published by Zhang in 2017, in which the same technology was applied for the first time successfully to produce cows with an increased resistance to bovine TB. So we can see that the science is getting there, and I'm sure it will get further as clinical trials and animal trials, etc., develop. So for this presentation, let's accept that it is possible. So what are the scientific risks? One of the major concerns are obviously the potential off-target effects, which we do not know at the moment and which we will, like many other advanced biomedical technologies, will only find out through scientific research and clinical trials. These off-target effects may induce gene mutations, chromosomal translocations, to name but a few. But it does not take away from the fact that CRISPR-Cas9 is still considered as a potential antiviral tool for HIV and TB. But HIV, like the COVID-19 virus, has evolved escaping mechanisms. So even though it may be applicable to CCR5, this virus has evolved to also use CXCR, sorry, my screen has been disrupted by the video, as alternative co-receptors. So there's another route which they may follow to still infect people. And then the side effects of permanent editing CCR5, we do not know. So this is the current status of the science on this matter. Then let's come back to vaccines in respect of biomedical issues. Vaccines have a long and wonderful history of vaccines being developed, vaccine hesitancy following shortly after, and at the end of the day, vaccines eradicated a numerous number of diseases such as smallpox, polio, and to name but a few. So, but in the concept or in the context of vaccines, you must distinguish between therapy, it's definitely not a therapy, prevention and enhancement. And this falls within the prevention realm. It prevents people from getting some form of illness. But if you apply vaccines in the context of gene editing and germline gene editing, some may even argue that it is causing an enhancement, which is debatable. In the European Ethics of Genome Technologies report that came out in May 2021, it specifically says that, or it asks the question, how technologies can serve our common goals and values, and the fact that safety must be framed in its broadest sense, including psychological, social, and environment. So gene editing in vaccines cannot be seen merely as a bodily intervention. It must be seen, especially considering the safety issues, from a psychological, social, and environment context as well. And obviously, they ask the ever-present question, who gets to decide what is safe enough? And it speaks to patient and parental autonomy, which Bongi alluded to earlier. So let's discuss some of the criticisms that gene editing suffer from in the context of a possible vaccine based on gene editing technologies for HIV and TB. The first question they always ask is, what is natural? And Bongi so beautifully displayed dignity and what is human and how it's considered in different contexts. So if you want to consider what is natural, maybe look at it from the opposite angle, considering what is unnatural. Now, in South Africa, we've seen from the reports that it's socioeconomic issues that drive the TB pandemic and primary infections or primary infections. Children often born in poor socioeconomic circumstances are more prone to be born into circumstances where they have a greater possibility of being exposed to infection, exposed to people that are already infected with TB, HIV, and they also are born into circumstances where they have a limited ability to protect themselves against these infections. As we've seen from the reports, more than 60 or 66% of the survey participants did not seek medical care. So they did not receive treatments, they did not cure themselves in respect of TB, and in the process, they are transmitting these illnesses in the case of TB, which is completely curable. As we've also seen in certain socioeconomic circumstances with the coronavirus, especially exacerbated by lockdown, some people are limited to live in such dense living conditions that lockdown may actually make the transmission of the coronavirus worse, or the possibility that you can get infected worse. And this is the same with TB. Some people are simply being born into those circumstances. And a very, very unfortunate effect of the lockdown during Corona, and something that South Africa in particular struggled with for quite some time, is gender-based violence and rape, which is obviously something which can exacerbate the infection of HIV or the transmission of HIV. So this is definitely not natural circumstances for human beings to thrive in and to live to their fullest potential and to exercise their human rights as determined by the Constitution. So this is just one of the issues which I was thinking that if you could vaccinate people against TB and HIV, you can at least give them a head start to enter as a natural human being, a healthy human being, entering into such unnatural circumstances, to give them a springboard to proceed from, and enable them to live a meaningful life without being stuck by the socioeconomic circumstances, at least what the health issues pertains. So another issue is, or another criticism is, but aren't we challenging the divine creation? We are created by God, and if you tamper with the genes, you are actually playing in a playing field which is limited to the divine entities, and it's not yours for the taking, not yours for the playing. But if we vaccinate people to be immune to TB, HIV, or whatever the case may be, if we get there someday, aren't we making people more into the image of a divine entity? Divine entities does not suffer from HIV, TB, illnesses, and I'm sure in most, if not all religions, divine entities wish people to live healthy, happy, productive, meaningful lives. And by vaccinating people via gene editing against TB and HIV, you will actually create people closer to the divine image than before. Another criticism is transforming human nature via eugenics. If, again, my argument will be, if you vaccinate people against TB and HIV, aren't you enabling people to participate, healthy people, to participate in education, eventually in the economy, and grow a healthy population? By vaccinating a person to enter a healthy environment where such a person would otherwise have been prone to be exposed to infections, infection rates, etc., like I explained before, isn't that a form of eugenics as well? If you do not fix the socioeconomic circumstances, if you do not allow them to participate in a country on all levels based on their constitutional human rights, isn't that a form of eugenics, excluding the gene editing, of course? So by including gene editing via these vaccinations, aren't you leveling the playing fields? These are all questions that needs to be investigated further. And one of the very clever scientists always said, you need to ask the right questions, not find the right answers immediately. So coming back to humanness and humanization, I'm not going to say a lot about this because Bongi's spoken eloquently about this before. But we need to have a look at what our responsibilities are as humans to humanity, to each other, what our nature is as human beings, and is it necessary to assume responsibility in the face of such serious diseases that will affect generation after generation? And from the statistics, it's clear that HIV and TB is not under control with the current therapies and the current frameworks in place. And it is going on for generations to generation to generation. So something needs to be done. And as we've seen with COVID and the vaccines, if one person is vaccinated, it doesn't matter whether you're a frontline worker or whether you're a grandma that is staying at home because you decide to stay so. Every person that's being vaccinated is to the benefit of the entire world at this stage. Isn't the same true if we can vaccinate people against TB and HIV? Don't we have a responsibility to humanity in that context? However, humanness, as Bongi said, or dignity, can be assessed from various perspectives. Depends on who you ask, whether that person's background is biomedical, philosophical, sociological, ethical, or religious, and it can continues. You need to assess the impact on shared ethical principles and rights. So dignity for every human being includes the dignity to right of bodily and psychological integrity, respect for autonomy, freedom of research, justice, non-discrimination, right to life, etc., etc. So on a biological basis, genetics will not necessarily change these. Or will it? Will the change in genes by gene editing to vaccinate people against HIV and TB not change the dignity and the right to bodily and psychological integrity, the right to life that people will enter this world in for the good, considering the aforementioned slides I've discussed? So although genes do not exclusively determine the individual, and his or her personality or life. It is a framework in which humans are empowered to determine themselves and lead individual self-fulfilling lives. That is, if your genetic framework allows you to live a healthy, productive life. So another argument or criticism against gene editing is diversity, human diversity, and biodiversity. I'm not going to go into biodiversity. We're discussing human heritable gene editing. The question is, what will the biological impacts and the sociological impacts be if you tinker with human genetics? And the main question here is, will it expand or narrow genetic diversity? My argument would be, if you vaccinate people to live more healthy, productive lives, they will be in a position to participate in and to collaborate in more cultural events, more creativity, more scientific, the economy, etc. So in fact, you will actually increase genetic or cultural diversity, beliefs, worldviews, etc. Because then people, if you watch the documentary Bending the Arc, will not be obsessed, and reasonably so, with their health, with just struggling from one day to another, just to survive and to survive the treatment that TB requires of you. They will not need to worry about that. They can actually then participate and pour their energy into more creative, more meaningful, more productive work and lives, increasing the richness of what it means to live in a human community. And diversity in these days are accepted as good in our current history. I think we lived in the most diversity, inclusive, acceptable times ever in world's history. And this is a social goal that needs protection. So HHGE determining, another question is whether it will determine the kind of people a society might want to have. Yes, it will determine the kind of people our society might want to have. In the context of a TB and HIV vaccine, it will create people that is healthy, that will participate, that will contribute to a positive society, as opposed to people that will need social welfare, that will need infrastructure. And it's common knowledge that in South Africa, we live in an over-disease-burdened society or country that is severely under-resourced. So it may tip the balances in that regard if we can vaccinate people to live more healthy lives. And if they live healthy lives, everything that they can do with those lives, cultural, linguistic diversity, etc., are protected by international human rights. So gene editing may actually, in this context, be a link between human diversity and human rights to enable people to participate and exercise their freedom, autonomy, justice, and solidarity. So, and one of the last questions, or the last and big criticism, is transcending the safe enough framework. Safety of technology is crucial and it's of critical ethical importance. Technological interventions, whatever it may be, are meant to benefit people and societies with no disproportionate negative consequences for individuals or groups. It must do more good than harm. It's as easy as that. However, what constitutes benefit, risk, and harm depends on a number of things. The scientific evidence to start with, personal preferences and values, cultural values, societal attitudes, what is acceptable in society, as well as existing governance frameworks. So from this perspective, aren't we constantly taking risks? I'm always coming back to, I'm raising 2 teenage boys, and just to have children is a constant risk, because you never know what you will encounter the following day, what world ideas your kids will develop. Will they develop some sickness? Will they fall and break an arm? So these are just everyday risks you encounter as a parent, and you have to deal with them. And it's one of those risks you take on readily when you decide to have children, because its society is accepting of it. And everybody takes those risks. But what if we reach a stage if society becomes accepting of gene editing, and more specifically in this presentation, the vaccination of TB and HIV, for starters. So we are constantly taking risks, but the degree depends obviously on the situation and on the previous factors I've alluded to, scientific evidence, etc., etc. So safe enough is thus a highly contextualized or dependent on the context of the society you live in. Technologies deemed to be safe enough does not exclude all risks as well. And that includes physical, psychological, social, long-term risks, absence of alternatives, etc., etc. So it's complex to say these technologies are safe enough, look at the numbers, the science says so. There's a lot of other factors that need to be taken into account as well. And then you get the technological imperative, the notion that if it is technology that's feasible, then it ought to be done. It's not necessarily so. My motor car can drive more than 200 kilometers an hour. Should I? Maybe not. And this is the same issue with technological imperatives. So these are just I think it's more questions than answers in respect of a possible HHGE, TB, HIV vaccine. However, therapy only applies to people suffering from disease. And an unborn baby is obviously not yet suffering from TB or HIV. Having said that, the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, psychological, and social well-being. And prevention in this context is defined as activities that are designed to reduce the likelihood that something harmful will occur. And that is the premise of my argument. Isn't HHGE vaccine against TB, HIV a possible design to reduce the likelihood that something bad will happen, something harmful will happen to the still to be born baby and generations thereafter? And will this not result in a state of complete physical, psychological, and social well-being, at least from a TB, HIV perspective? So these are just some of the issues I wanted to raise as a debate point this morning. But still, these technologies require a global governance approach in the current lack of robust global governance structures, because you can see, like the vaccines and the COVID-19 pandemic, it is a global issue that entails people all over the world. The reason for the lack of global governance structures is the lack of consensus between scientists at the current moment. As was seen in 2015 during the International Summit on Human Gene Editing, it was said that the clinical use of HHGE should not proceed without broad societal consensus. Unfortunately, this broad societal consensus has been weakened over the time, to the extent that in 2018, during the International Summit on Human Genome Editing, there was a call for a translational pathway to germline editing, but only cursory mentions were made of potential to societal effects. And I hope my presentation today alerted you to the societal effects of what human germline editing can have if implemented in a society with the example of TB, HIV as a vaccine. So going forward, and coming back to my African philosophy as a pioneer, or cautiously going forward, not rushing in the angel's field to tread, I think we need to go forward. We owe it to ourselves, and most importantly, we owe it to humanity. But having said that, we need to adhere to established principles of human rights, bioethics, and global governance. And clinical pathways to HHGE needs to incorporate best practices from related technologies. And the clinical implementation must be reviewed, at least at this stage, on a case-by-case basis by appropriate independent international body. And we must create practice guidelines, standards, and policies for the clinical uses of HHGE now, prior to the offering of any clinical use thereof, so that law can for once in its lifetime be proactive instead of reactive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Booth. It's very interesting. I already have a few questions myself in my mind, but I will keep them for the discussions. But so first, it is my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Uzma Alam. Dr. Alam is a global health professional focusing on the use of evidence and innovation to inform strategies and policies. Her work has appeared globally across print and other media outlets. Dr. Alam is the former secretary of the Association of Women in Science and editor of the Yale Journal of Health Policy, Law and Ethics. Presently, she leads the biomedical and health sciences portfolio of the Developing Excellence Leadership and Training in Science in Africa program. She also heads the African Science, Technology and Innovation Priorities program. This program engages Africa's science and political leaders to identify the top science, technology and innovation priorities for the continent that, if addressed, offer the highest possible return on investment for Africa's sustainable development. So over to you, Dr. Alam.
Thank you, Donrich. And if you just give me a second to share my screen.
It's coming on, it's coming on.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so thank you. So just listening to the previous two speakers, I just want to put this out to the rest of the audience that my talk is going to be a very dry talk compared to those, because I come from a science background, and what I'm presenting today is evidence or the thoughts from stakeholders across from Africa. Do we even need to go down the genomic medicine pathway? And a part of genomic medicine obviously is gene editing. So having said that, greetings everybody all the way from Nairobi. I'm Dr. Uzma Alam, and I head the scientific prioritization program, which is implemented by the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa. And like I mentioned, over the next few moments, I would just like to bring to everyone's attention some of the discussions that we've been having around genomic medicine and biospecimen governance, which is a part of precision medicine, so to speak. So just very briefly, what is the STI program? So we believe the ASP or the STI program is our shared path to deliver on Africa's most needed science, technology, and innovation priorities. And I think it's really critical to point out here that as a region, we need to focus, given that we have both limited resources and time, we need to focus on the opportunities that provide the most transformational impact for our people and our societies. And the program also works under the hypothesis of three main working arms through the co-identification of priorities and solutions to these problems. And this is by bringing stakeholders across the table, whether scientists, policymakers, practitioners, clinicians, general public, media to the table to engage around topics as defined and guided by regional agendas, such as the developmental agenda, STISA 2036. And then apart from co-creation of our priorities and solutions, the program also ensures secure buy-in. So at a regional level, through engagement with the Africa Scientific Advisory Board and the Africa Union Development Agency. And I think this is something I'd like everyone to keep in mind once we start discussing what the genomic medicine prioritization exercise pointed towards, because the previous speaker very eloquently already pointed out to the need for governance structures to be put in place if Africa chooses to go down the pathway of genomic medicine. And then lastly, we do ensure that we mobilize investments towards the priorities. And again, this is at international level and regional levels. And then the ASP objective is very, very simple. It's empowering African ownership of our research and innovation agenda. And in the case of genomic medicine, we believe it's empowering Africa's ownership of our genetic data and information. And we work through accelerating the impact by working through stakeholders, enhancing knowledge, leading calls to action, influencing evidence-informed policy making, and informing decision making. And just to point out the date that we've had multiple prioritization activities across very different varied topics, but the two really important ones for today's discussion are based on the work from genomic medicine and data and biospecimen governance, which we worked in back in 2019. So the first question we put out to the stakeholders, right, is what is genomic medicine? How do we define it in the African context? And do we even need to go down the path of genomic medicine? So the answer was very simple. Genomic medicine is an emerging field which involves understanding a person's or personalized genetic information to target clinical care. And why does Africa even need to go down the genomic medicine pathway? So as we all know, Africa is home to over 1.2 billion people across 54 countries. And we have the richest genetic base within the world. In fact, data points out that Africa has more genetic ancestries than the whole world combined. So we have a big genetic mine, so to speak. And yet Africa's genetic diversity remains understudied because most, in fact, all I should say, genomic medicine and research work is done in the Northern Hemisphere. And unfortunately, what this translates to is that any new advances in genomic medicine, including in diagnostics, are tailored more to the Western populations and are not applicable to our populations. But yet, Africa constitutes, despite constituting only 17% of the global population, it has the highest disease burden in the world at 27%. And most of this disease burden happens to be infectious diseases, but we are undergoing an epidemiological transition towards non-communicable diseases such as cancer and heart attacks, which are obviously lifestyle diseases, but also associated with age structure. And both these factors do have a genetic undertrait, so can be influenced by genetics. And then something that's not captured in this slide, but very critical to mention, that Africa and our nations are under extreme different environmental pressures and climate change. And there's been a clear link between climate change, environmental health, and human impact. And in fact, there are also a lot of genetic bases for certain conditions around environment and infectious diseases. For example, the link between sickle cell trait and malaria, and malaria being endemic to a certain country is linked to temporal patterns, so linked to host environments. And then, so it was very clear, or at least it was clear to the stakeholders, that we need genomic medicine. But why? What are barriers to implementing genomic medicine? And the two big one was, obviously we have limited access to resources, and also there is a lack of knowledge around genomic medicine. And the third argument that was put forward was that, look, as a region, we have weak health systems. Genomic medicine is very technology intensive. It's very data intensive. It's very capacity intensive. So it's a barrier. But yet, understanding African genetic diversity offers a way to drive efficiency and effectiveness into these healthcare systems by providing very targeted and targeted healthcare or prevention. So the argument that came forward through these meetings was, yes, Africa does need to go under, does need to follow the genomic pathway. So the next question was, all right, so if we do undergo genomic medicine, what are the priority areas that we as a region need to focus on? And obviously, the three that came up were very counterintuitive. The first one is obviously what impact can be achieved by going down the genomic pathway, right? So what is the sensitivity and specificity of any approach we take? And I think a previous speaker alluded to this, how effective is a outcome. And then obviously we need to understand a better understanding of genetics and clinical and environmental risk factors, especially in the African context, just given what I stated from the previous slide. And then obviously one big priority area for genomic medicine within Africa would be to understand, and this is linked to weak health systems, would be to understand correct doses of different medications and regimes, and also successful treatments. And this mainly refers to the non-communicable diseases, such as the cancer. So what is the right treatment option for a specific person with a specific type of cancer with a specific genetic footprint? So in order to go down this path and implement such, there were obviously very key ethical, social, and legal implications that come to the forefront. So what are these recommendations around these? So the recommendations that came out from these teleconvenings and gatherings with policymakers, scientists, and stakeholders were, one, that as a region, if Africa is going to go down the genomic medicine pathway, we do need to start cataloging the national level legal legislation across African countries. And this stems from the idea that genomic studies are very intensive, sample size intensive. Africa is very genetically diverse, so we cannot necessarily say, think of it as a isolated study. So we cannot think of it as, one gene editing mechanism was developed in the Kenyan population and it can be applied in the next neighboring population. It just wouldn't work. But yet we do know, and I think the first speaker pointed out to this, that there are very different legal guidelines across African nations. So we do need to start having a matrix in place of how genomic medicine is guided legally across the different countries in Africa. And then secondly, there is a call to draft an African Treaty on Research Integrity. And this again comes from the philosophy, I should say, of putting societal good before research good. So it's more about protecting our people and our societies. And then obviously there should be an understanding of how genomic medicine can be made available across all our countries. And the key word here is in an equitable manner. There was a call to establish guidelines for informed consent. And this comes from the factor of we have a number of barriers, and informed consent is very critical to in an individual's choice and understanding of whether they choose to go down the genomic medicine pathway. We do need to develop training for community public engagement. This is a key to any pathway to sustainability and self-awareness. There was a call to develop processes to evaluate ethics implementation, and these are both in research settings, but also in clinical trials, and there was across the timelines, just not during, but also pre and post. And then there was a call to provide training for councils and genomic projects, and then creating an experts platform community of practice to actually oversee and guide all the policy and legal frameworks. And then moving on to data and biospecimen governance very quickly. So the priority areas that were identified were community engagement, ethics, governance in the time of crisis, data access, ethical and regulatory oversight of benefit sharing agreements, translation, innovation, and IP rights. And I think the COVID pandemic, very clearly highlights the importance of translation, innovation, and IP rights. It very clearly highlights, community engagement and the issues around data access. So what were the key recommendations for the biosciences? So it was very strongly put forward that informed consent must be preceded by a deliberate effort to understand and appreciate the local values where the research is to be conducted. So i.e. Understanding the African society, understanding our communities as a whole, and valuing local knowledge. We need to avoid using broad consent for prospective data and biospecimen reuse. And actually, this is an issue globally where a specimen or a data point is collected under very broad consent and then used for a totally different totally different reason or totally different region or altogether. African researchers and institutions must be protected against surrendering their autonomy and authority as stewards of African participant specimen and data. And this comes from the idea that African scientists and clinicians are not necessarily stakeholders, or should not be necessarily considered as stakeholders when it comes to genomic medicine, but more as keepers of and stewards of specimens and data. And then we do need to manage conflict very carefully, and this is both funders and researchers, by keeping a healthy distance between the consent form, our ethical guidelines, and funders. And then African nations need to establish and support national authorities and ensure suitable guidelines are in place for genomic medicine and biospecimen governance. And so finally, what are the key action items that were identified by the stakeholders if we are to go down the pathway of genomic medicine and biospecimen governance? So one, we need to start educating and empowering our communities through CPE, community public engagements. We need to focus on our local context, so local communities, local knowledge. We need to start exploring new technologies, and this especially comes in terms of biospecimen tracking. So for example, cases where one specimen has been split into multiple vials and translated to, a number of different labs, but yet collected centrally at one point. We do need to develop a Pan-African guidelines for data governance. And in line with this is that we do need to provide guidelines and policies for negotiating benefit sharing terms for research. And lastly, and most importantly, Africa as a whole needs to protect any IP that comes up from genomic studies and research, or any IP coming up from our data to promote African localization of translation across the value chain. And with that, I will stop, and thank you for your attention. Looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Dr. Alam, thank you very much. Very interesting. Again, there are a number of questions immediately in my mind, but I will keep them. I've written them down just here next to me. So it's now over to our fourth presenter for today, which is Professor Kevin Behrens. Professor Behrens is the director of the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics at the University of the Witwatersrand. His research interests lie in the area of applied ethics, in particular bioethics and environmental ethics. A major emphasis in his work is on applying African moral philosophy to ethical questions. He has published widely in international and national journals, and he is a former editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Business Ethics. Professor Behrens, we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Donrich, and thank you to the organizers for putting this colloquium together. and for giving me this opportunity to present today. I'm going to do as everyone else has done and try to share my screen. Give me a moment. Are you seeing it?
Yes, we can see it. I think you can just maximize. Yeah. There we go.
Great, thanks. And I'm just going to switch off this video now because I can only do one thing at a time. Okay, so I'm not an expert in genome editing. And what I have to share with you today really is hardly even a beginning of a paper. It is, in fact, a reworked presentation that I gave at the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing in Hong Kong in 2018, which some of you may recall is the conference at which the news about He Jiankui's CRISPR twins broke. So it was a fascinating conference to be at. But I'd been asked to talk a little bit about the human genome editing through the lens of African thought, and put together a really quick presentation, which I haven't been able to do terribly much work on since then. But I do hope that at least some of these ideas, and that's all that they are, kind of tasters, will stimulate discussion and further work in what I think is an important field of developing work in this topic in the African philosophical tradition. Okay, so I'm going to begin with just a brief overview of how I understand the lay of the land when it comes to views on ethics around heritable genome editing. Of course, at one extreme, we have those who would reject this altogether, and would possibly even reject somatic gene editing and even possibly basic research on the grounds that it's against some kind of natural law or is playing God, which is taken to be an egregious moral wrong. And then, of course, there are those who would argue from a perspective of sanctity of life, would hold sanctity of life views that would entail that they would need to reject any kind of use of embryos in research or pre-implantation technology. And what I'm going to do with those views is simply set them aside and not address them at all, and rather focus on some of the other less extreme positions that are taken. Apart from those views, I think that there is something of a reasonable degree of consensus among scientists and ethicists and others who have a professional interest in these matters on at least 2 points. And I think the first is that there seems to be an openness to cautious and regulated research, as well as to some use of somatic gene editing, as long as it is cautiously done. And I think the second is that there's a broad agreement that heritable genome editing is still quite ethically problematic, at least until such time as the safety issues have been resolved and off-target effects and other possible unforeseen harms are significantly reduced. Over and above that, I think there's some other notable ethical concerns centered around notions, obviously, of informed consent about future people and worries about the use of gene editing for enhancement purposes. Yeah, so I think that's the basic lay of the land in terms of positions that are currently being held. From a particularly South African or African perspective, I think there are probably 2 main areas of ethical concern. And the first is largely shared with the rest of the world, the global community, and it has to do with the potential risks related to heritable genome editing, especially the possibility of unforeseen harms that could be perpetuated to future generations. And I suspect that many Africans, like many others in the world, would favor applying some kind of precautionary principle and not moving too hastily into that kind of uncharted territory. The second concern that I think is notable in Africa are concerns around equity issues. And these issues are probably not as high on the agenda in many other parts of the world, but for developing countries, and I think especially for those of us in the global south, we are very aware of the huge discrepancies in wealth and infrastructure and power that already exist between different parts of the world. And I think there's some deep worries that research into and implementation of these sorts of interventions based on heritable genome editing will end up serving the needs only of the rich and powerful and of the rich and powerful nations and their people. And this will possibly become just yet another example of elitist medicine, which would obviously be a concern. There are also some justice issues that I think are grounded in past bad experiences of Africans bearing a disproportionate burden as trial participants for treatments, and those treatments not then becoming readily available to the citizens of this continent. So these are two, I think, important areas of ethical concern that sort of will be behind much of what I have to say in the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to focus on three salient moral notions that have an African pedigree, and I'm just going to try to very tentatively unpack very simply how these conceptions might be able to provide some guidance in terms of navigating our way through this area, which is so fraught with moral dilemmas and other kinds of ethical questions. Now, whenever one talks about any kind of African ideas or moral positions, one is often confronted by those who say that you need to avoid the danger of homogenizing and assuming that the ideas are ideas which are found across the whole of Africa. And I acknowledge fully that this is a large continent with very different groups of people, with very different belief systems and values, and as much diversity as you would find on these ideas as anywhere else in the world. But nonetheless, I do think that there are some broad philosophical and ethical notions that are fairly prevalent and broadly shared, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm going to base my discussion on some of these. I'm also not going to try to suggest that these notions are unique to Africa. I think you'll find them in other parts of the world other than the West as well. So the first of these salient African notions that I think is of relevance is the idea that all entities have some kind of life force or vital force. Thaddeus Metz has described this conception as life force has been traditionally interpreted as an intrinsically valuable energy that is imperceptible and constitutes everything that exists. All things in the universe, even apparently inanimate objects such as a grain of sand or a drop of oil, are thought to be both good and real by virtue of having some degree of life force, with plants having a greater share of it than rocks, animals having more than plants, human beings having more than animals, ancestors whose bodies have died but who live on in an imperceptible realm on earth having more than humans, and God, the source of all life force, having the most. All beings in the world are thought to participate in the divine energy. Now, often this kind of thinking, illness and mental distress are often thought of as being associated with some kind of diminishment of the life force of an individual, and healing of the body or healing of the mind is then achievable through restoring this life force. So Placido Temples famously wrote that every illness, wound or disappointment, all suffering or fatigue, every injustice and every failure, all of these are held to be and are spoken of as diminution of vital force. There's this idea that this life force then can be restored and there are various ways in which it can be stored. So traditionally, you could restore life force through use of potions or talismans or divination using objects that are believed to have their own life force, or medicine that is created from other things that have their own life force. Benazet Bujo writes that it is the task of the human person to study the cosmos in order to identify plants, animals, and minerals that possess that life force, which can liberate one from physical and psychic suffering. Hence, the traditional healer in Africa does not only include the community of the living and the dead in his healing practices, he also uses natural elements like minerals, plants, pieces of wood, animal bones, teeth, and hair, etc. Close quote. I think it might even be argued that on this view, there is even a moral obligation on us to do what we can to restore the life force of others when it is diminished. Now, this way of thinking seems to me to open up the possibility of an acceptance of heritable genome editing, at least that which is intended to prevent illness or to treat illness. It would be no more playing God or acting against nature than many existing traditional healing practices are. So if we are able to restore the life force of the sick, it is just another way of healing. And using our ingenuity to augment the waning life force of others is an intrinsically good act. Of course, other interpretations are possible, and it's clear that many non-Africans will not be able to accept some of the unfamiliar metaphysical beliefs that underlie this thinking. But all I really have been hoping to do here is to demonstrate that I think there is some scope within African indigenous ideas for these technologies to find social and ethical justification. I am less certain about the use of heritable genome editing for enhancement rather than for the prevention or treatment of illness, and that is an area that I need to consider more deeply myself. The second salient African ethical conception that I want to discuss has to do with moral obligations to future generations. Now, the very idea that it is possible for us to have obligations towards beings that we cannot know, towards beings that do not yet exist, and beings who cannot reciprocate, has been the subject of deep philosophical debate for some time, especially within the context of environmental problems. And in the West, some argue that it is up to each generation to look after itself, and others concede that we might have some obligations to posterity, but that they should be discounted over time so that our responsibilities kind of fade away after a few generations into the future. Now, of course, there are many in the West who also do recognize some duties to posterity, but it is clear that the collective behavior of Western society hardly reflects this belief, given the evidence that we have of the damage that the West has done to the environment broadly construed. So John O'Neill has written that there is a temporal myopia, a blindness that infects modern society. The question of obligations to future generations is posed in terms of abstract obligations to possible future people who are strangers to us. And the argument, he says, is premised on the lack of a sense of continuity of the present with both the past and the future. By contrast, the African philosopher Kwasi Wiredu writes, of all of the duties owed to the ancestors, none is more imperious than that of husbanding the resources of the land so as to leave it in good shape for posterity. In this moral scheme, the rights of the unborn play such a cardinal role that any traditional African would be nonplussed by the debate in Western philosophy as to the existence of such rights. Now, while this is obviously written within the context of environmental ethics or concern, Wiredu's words reflect that moral obligation towards future generations have a very central place in much African thought. And his view is supported by many other African theorists, Amoluche Namani, Matthew Isibili, and Bonginkosi earlier also quoted Felix Morove in exactly this context. So the notion of moral duties to posterity is certainly much more clearly entrenched in African thought than it is, broadly speaking, in Western thought. Now, this very strong obligation sense of obligation towards future generation seems to advise some sort of caution about proceeding with heritable genome editing, at least to the point in which we are now implanting edited genes that can be passed on into wombs. Until it is far more certain about, we are far more certain about the effect that such interventions have on future people, it seems to be unethical to proceed to these interventions that would carry edited genes reproductively into future generations, particularly since the harm could be done as a result. So I think the African sense of strong obligations to descendants suggests that we have a very profound, a very deep responsibility not to play Russian roulette with the genetics of future people. As Wirudu puts it, this is an imperious duty. But notwithstanding the need for extreme caution, it seems to me that this same strong duty to posterity paradoxically could also provide moral justification for altering the germline in the interests of future generations. Provided we'd be able to do so safely and with a minimal risk of harm, surely if we had the ability to make significant progress towards ridding our continent of, say, sickle cell disease and many of the other hereditary diseases that exist, and to greatly reduce incidence of TB, incidence of HIV. Surely if we were capable of doing this, then an imperious duty to future generations should compel us to do so. So tentatively, I conclude that the African strong sense of obligation to future generations might well ultimately justify using this sort of technology. But what it would demand is caution, and so we can do so with some sort of safety and confidence. And then my last taster is focused on a preference for decision-making by consensus. So in many African communities, traditionally decisions have been made, decisions of consequence anyway, by getting the community together to talk it out until they find sufficient consensus to agree. And clearly, it's not easy to replicate this kind of system that works well in a village, in a small community, in the global context. But nonetheless, I think the wisdom that underlies this preference is that allowing everybody to have their say, involving everyone in a decision, hearing everyone's voices, and continuing to work at things until you have at least sufficient consensus makes for much better sustainable and practical choices. So when I attended this conference and the summit in Hong Kong in 2018, one of the things that struck me very clearly was how few of the speakers and how few of the panelists were from the global south. And the voices of the developing world were hardly heard at all at that summit. And furthermore, patient advocacy groups were hardly represented there either. And surely some of those who have the most interest in this sort of development and technology would be those who are concerned about people who are suffering from illness. So perhaps the most important contribution that African ethics can make to this entire debate is to remind the global community that decisions about some things that can affect the future of our entire species should be made in collaboration. That we should seek to hear as many diverse voices as possible, and that the West needs to be open to hearing the voices of people on other parts of the world as well. So with some hesitance, I submit that I think that there are notions in African philosophy and thought that may well justify the future use of heritable genome editing, and at least for the purposes of promoting health. But I also think that until concerns about safety and possible unanticipated effects are resolved, that the strong sense of obligation to future generations would advise us to proceed with some caution. So I'll conclude with a simple African proverb that says, only a fool tests the depth of a river with both feet. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Beerens. And I think that's a very wise proverb there at the end. So everyone, the floor is now open for questions and comments. Let us use the normal Zoom protocol. If you want to comment or ask a question, then just raise your hand and I will then give you the floor. So while we're waiting for potential questions, I can perhaps start with a question or two. Well, the last one that I dotted down here for myself was during Professor Beerens' talk about life force. And my question is, can life force be strengthened by genetic enhancement? Perhaps I can ask Professor Beerens to answer that first, and any of the other panel members who would also like to weigh in on that.
Yes, so as I said, the one part of this that I haven't given that much thought to yet is exactly around enhancement. And obviously there are different and more complex ethical concerns around enhancement as opposed to simply treatment or prevention of illness in this sort of context. And a lot of them relate to how far will this go and slippery slopes and all of that kind of thing. But I certainly do think that an argument can be made that life force can be increased by enhancement, and that it may in fact then mean that an argument could be made based on some African conceptions of life force for some use of this kind of technology for enhancement as well as treatment.
Thank you, Professor Beerens. Would any one of the other panel members like to weigh in on this question?
Sure, I'll throw my head in. The life force theory of personhood in African philosophy, I will say straight up, is not one that I'm necessarily an expert on. But my understanding of it is that the idea that each object or each thing has a life force, the life force is something that's not necessarily measurable. It's something that one either has or thing either has or doesn't. And so the idea that you could necessarily enhance it, I think might go against how life force is generally conceived of. Although theoretically, I think at the very least, you could make an argument for genetic interventions for the reason of maintaining life force. So if an individual would be subject to something that would diminish their health and well-being, then there's potentially an argument there from that particular theoretical perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Shorzy. There are two hands raised. First, Ms. Leroux, and after that, Professor Kinderlehrer.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the presenters and contributors today. It was a very enjoyable and extremely interesting discussion. Yes. So I thoroughly enjoyed all the discussants' contributions. I just have one question directed particularly, well, to everyone really on the panel. But it came about or propagated during Professor Behrens' talk about, or relating to a specific comment he made at the end, where he noted the domination of the global north in the global discussion on matters relating to gene editing that has an impact on the entire human family. And he made a remark specifically so, saying that we need to get the West to hear the African voice more predominantly so, or to feature more in this global discussion. And I guess my question is whether you have any thoughts on how we go about getting the West to hear the African voice and perspective in the global South perspective, specifically so when the entire institution and the structure of bioethics and medical ethics is Western in its history, its origin, its ethics, its values. How do we get an African perspective in there that's not just, to take the quip, African spice to a very white-dominated institution? Any thoughts from any of the panelists in that regard? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Leroux. May I ask if you have any suggestion yourself?
Rupture. So as someone who is currently doing her research in more of an abolitionist approach to the entire episteme, really, for me it's rupture. So in any form of conformity, any form of trying to compromise in this regard, I find it rather frustrating in the greater scheme of things. And although I don't have answers myself as to how we go about doing so on a practical level, and it's in toto, I am very interested to hear what the panel thinks of then rupture as well, since that's on the table.
Thank you.
How do we deviate from a system without, or how do we change a system that is not an evolution of the current institution, but actually humanizes people at the end of the day?
So I can take a shot at that.
Yes, Dr. Alam.
Yes, I can share our experience on that matter. And like I said, part of the ASP program was set up for this very reason, that we need to control our voices and we need to be heard, right? So what does this mean? For us, it meant generating local evidence. So evidence speaks volumes, right? If we want to go and make a case for something, then we need to have that data. We need to have the ideas and the solutions to put forward. And then the second critical piece, and again, that's how our program has been set up, is to ensure that we have buy-in. And buy-in means, especially in our context, in the African context, political buy-in is a big one, right? And that's why we work so closely with the big governing bodies, as difficult as they might be, the outer NEPADs, WHO, AFROS, Africa CDC. And buy-in means that we work with them right from the beginning, not towards the end. And the third big piece that has really worked for us is, realizing, and this comes to the exact same point that, Africa or the West cannot make a decision that affects the rest of the world. So we do need partnerships. We're not saying that Africa should go all the way itself. It can in certain ways, and it can lead it, but we do need equitable North-South and South-South partnerships. And this is the model that has been really successful for our program, at the African Scientific Priorities Program. And just to give you an actual physical example of how this played out in reality. So as we know, climate change was one of our big priority areas, and climate change, Africa stands to have the biggest negative impact from climate change, yet we contribute the least to it. And the only governing body who actually makes guidelines and regulations around climate change is the IPCC. And in the IPCC, we did not have African voices, right? In the last two editions, the fourth and fifth, we did it. Till, this round, I'm pleased to say, using this ASP model, getting our policymakers involved, getting our youth involved, getting the community involved, right? Generating the evidence. We've actually, just concluded a event with them where we've actually contributed to what Africa's evidence says about climate change and, how this should shape the sixth IPCC report coming out. So there is a way, and I think it comes to our African spirit of unity and harnessing local knowledge. That's what's worked for us so far.
The key words that I've picked up from what you've said is to generate evidence locally. Local evidence. And then also engagement by, engagement of policymakers locally, essentially agenda setting, if I understood you correctly.
Basic steps.
If some of our other panel members, any solutions from your side? Perhaps Professor Behrens, if I can ask you, you mentioned that there was at that particular conference not a lot of voices from the global south. Is it because of any kind of exclusion, or is it because of lack of interest? Do you have any insight on why that was the case and how we can solve it?
Yeah. So as Ilana was asking her question, I was thinking she's going to ask the how question, isn't she? And it's one that I dread for exactly the reasons that we're already discovering here. I don't really know why that it is the case. I think sometimes it's just simple neglect to be considerate. I mean, I think they just simply don't take into account that they aren't the only people in the world who have an interest in this, and it's it's a kind of I suppose it's a kind of a disregard. But the only way in which we're going to be heard is to make ourselves heard. And it does occur to me that we're all interested in the same topic, yet none of us have any association with each other generally outside of a colloquium like this, and that there's no coming together to strategize, to work together to try to make sure that we are heard. I mean, why aren't we doing something? And that is contacting the people who organize this international summit and saying, next time, the third one, you need to get this right, and we can do that together. They might just ignore us, but it's worth a try.
No, well, absolutely. I fully support that. I think that would be a great initiative. Other panel members? Okay, well, let's then move on to Professor Kinderlehrer.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I've been involved in this for a very long time. So I was fascinated, and thank Mariki in particular, because she gave an interesting virtual summary of that which we wrote as the European Group on Ethics, and then put an African perspective on it, I hope. But there's many issues which I'd like to address. The first is the concept that Professor Behrens, who I'm afraid I can see only as a number on the screen, gave us on, is it safe enough? And what are the issues there? And I wanted to comment that all medical procedures carry risk. And what we're asking is the risk of this medical procedure different in any sense from the risk of any other which may affect the germline? And there are many which affect the germline. So we've got to think about that, and what is sufficient risk to stop us doing something. Because if we don't have that, then we shouldn't proceed. The WHO international group which is talking about this, which hasn't yet produced its final report, is talking about a moratorium. And I keep on saying a moratorium has to have an endpoint. We have to know where the point is, where we can start. Otherwise, we'd call it something else, we'd call it a ban. So please, we need to define an endpoint. And that brings me to this concept of Ubuntu that Longi was talking about. Is the responsibility for an individual having a modification to the germline only that of the individual? Or does the society have an input, the group to which they belong, have an input into that decision for that individual, particularly as it may go wrong? And we haven't really discussed that in great detail. There's many other issues, the concept that the European Group on Ethics, and if anybody wants the report, we can easily send that. We talked about justice, about the difference in social economic availability, about medical tourism in this instance, which is likely to occur and may involve the global south. Because although the technology is being developed essentially in the global north, the use of the technology may be even by Western scientists in the global south because of the lack of regulation. So we've got to be aware of all these sorts of questions. And I was fascinated by the discussion, but having thought about this with you, Donrich, and with the European group over about 5 years, there are many open questions, both for the West that I was involved in, except Europe has countries which are possibly even in the global south, Bulgaria, Romania, and so on, in the economic sense. And we don't know where to go, actually. We know now that the technology isn't as good as people have been making out. That multiple insertions may occur, which are no problem when we're talking about crops, and maybe for animals like mice and zebrafish, but are a problem for commercial animals like cows and sheep and for humans. And we have to think about the implications of making modifications which could have such implications. Should we start with crops, identify what the problems are, identify what the likelihood of unwanted modifications are, which we can easily see in a crop. And that gives us a picture in a higher organism of the possible problems that might result using these technologies. And then, and that's already happening, of course, but no reports are coming out. And then we can move with a fair degree of safety for, first of all, somatic cell modification, or at least multipotent rather than totipotent cells, stem cells, and then move on to possible modification of the human. So I would do it in steps. And I think this is part of an African philosophy as well. I would do it in steps from nature and see what that does to animals and see what that does to somatic cells, to therapeutic use, possibly to enhancement as a final step when we know enough to say we can do it safely. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Kinderlehrer. Insightful as always. Would any one of the panel members like to respond?
Julian asked me a fairly direct question, so I would like to respond to that. And that's namely the role of the community when it comes to making decisions about germline interventions. Specifically, I think you were referring to making decisions about the kinds of germline interventions that are acceptable. And that definitely is something that is an important aspect of most African philosophical theories of morality and ethics, specifically Ubuntu. And that is why many African philosophies of ethics fall into the general umbrella of communitarianism. Because in African philosophy, there is the strong element that morality is not something that can be divorced from community. The idea that an individual actor can make moral decisions on their own without considering the effect of those decisions on broader society is something that's considered, completely backwards and completely contrary to the idea of what right and wrong means in the African context. And that for me was part of what was so compelling about African philosophy specifically and its impact on some of these issues raised by gene editing, because I think a lot of the quandaries about making ethical decisions in germline gene editing result from the fact that Western philosophy generally fixates to a great extent on the individual's rights, how they might reason things. But the problem is that germline interventions specifically are the nature of decision that by definition don't just impact the person making them. They impact the child that will be born, and that child will also live in a broader society who will be impacted by the existence of germline edited persons. And that touches on something that Professor Behrens touched on at the end of his talk, which is how consensus in the African context is the way in which group decisions are made rather than majoritarian determinations. And I think that that's an important element of any pathway towards germline gene editing in the South African context, which is deliberation in a social setting that's about consensus, that's about people thinking not only about should I as an individual be allowed to make this choice, but also about should I allow myself or my children to live in a society where other people make this choice, even if I don't necessarily think it's a morally good choice? Am I willing to accept a society where people who have made this choice will exist? And I think that's an important part of the discussion that African philosophy specifically emphasizes, this idea that we live in a community and preserving communal harmony is important. So we need to think about ethical decisions from the perspective of not just the individual making the choice, but also the broader society within which they live.
You've touched on something now, namely, well, this is a recurring theme in many of the ethics statements and so on that we've seen from all around the world, is the idea that there must first be not only public deliberation, but the idea that there must be public consensus of some sort prior to heritable genome editing being researched. I'm not even speaking of eventual clinical applications. So effectively, positioning public consensus as a precondition for research in this area. How does the panel feel about that? Is that isn't that perhaps setting a dangerous precedent for science, that you can only engage in certain scientific research if there has first been public deliberation and you have been able to convince perhaps not a majority, perhaps even an extended majority of people in your country, that the kind of scientific research that you want to engage in as a scientist is worthwhile or is perhaps morally good or somehow societally acceptable. I would like to hear the panelists' opinions on this. Since Mr. Shawsey spoke last, I will give him an opportunity to catch his breath first. So shall we start with Dr. Boertes?
Yes, thank you, Donry. In this respect, I'm not an expert by far stretch in African philosophy at all, but I can offer some personal experience with research I did in the Sun community, where the whole concept of the community must consent to something as opposed to the individual is something I definitely research in the context of genome research projects. And my finding there was very, very interesting and was contrary to everything I read. I asked them specifically with regards to how they make decisions, how they resolve conflicts, how they go about their daily lives. Is it a communitarian issue? Do they need to go to somewhere or someone else, or is it an individual issue? And through the bank, they said that no, it's an individual issue. They do not go to some form of council or elders or whatever the case may be for advice to resolve issues or to make decisions. And specifically in this context, there was issues giving consent for participating in a genomic research project. So that stunned me in the context that I hear what everybody say, and this is just my research results in the Sun community. But what I saw is that there's a change towards a more individualistic manner of taking medical decisions or decisions pertaining to participating in research from that specific research project. But there's one project, and as I say, I'm not an expert in African philosophy, it's just something I have firsthand experience in this regard. I would love to hear what the African philosophy experts have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Boertes. Dr. Alam or Professor Behrens, would you like to comment on this?
So unfortunately, my internet's not stable, so I've not heard the entire conversation, but if I heard right, the question was around consent and at the community level. So I can tell you again, not from an ethical perspective.
Yes, consent at the community level.
Yeah, but what I can tell you from being on the ground perspective, that there is a big push to ensure community and public engagement across all research and clinical trials coming out of Africa. And there are multiple reasons for this, right? One of those reasons I think touches to the point the last panelist spoke to of how, Africa has been involved in a lot of cutting edge science, yet it doesn't benefit our people. And one of the reasons why it doesn't have this uptake is because our communities haven't been engaged. And so we need to get them engaged. And this is only through, education, community public engagement, and consent. And a classical example of this came out during the Ebola epidemic, where, we had thrown in millions of dollars, millions of lives lost, all this time lost, and, all these interventions and stuff, and nothing changed. Still, we got in community buy-in. We got in, community buy-in literally translates to, community consensus. And yes, we will want to isolate, or we'll want to isolate X, Y, Z. And I think the other critical, the silent piece that this brings to the knowledge, the nugget knowledge that, going out to community and engaging in this manner, asking for consent, it's not a one-way relationship. It's literally a relationship that takes long-term, it's trust. But what happens is that from the other end, you also start learning about the context, right? And that is critical to impact and success, right? So in the past, a lot of medical interventions have gone wrong. And again, I can use a classical example of Ebola, right? We went out with this big message of, and I did this. I was one of the frontline workers in Sierra Leone, and I went with the standard WHO messaging, like saying, "Oh, don't eat bushmeat." If that's where Ebola comes from, till a community member came to me and said, "Listen, my ancestors have been having it for years. They never died of Ebola. Like, what are you on about?" Right? So I think this engagement to get consent is also about understanding and building that knowledge trust, which plays a really big role. I think that's how I would look at consent and community engagement.
Thank you, Dr. Alam. Professor Behrens, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, so I would caution against recommending something like, something that could become kind of the tyranny of the majority on a global scale. If we waited for broad consensus on scientific advancements, we probably wouldn't get anywhere. So stem cell research, for instance, wouldn't be happening if we were waiting for global consensus on that. So I don't think that's as far as I would want it to go. But where I think we are now is in a place in which, as Julian was suggesting, we need to start trying to unpack, when will things be safe enough? And I've thought for a while now that the kind of work we should be doing is, in principle, trying to say what things need to be in place. What security do we need? What minimum standards have to be met for us to reach a point in which we can do, let's say, some kind of research on involving this kind of thing. And I think that's what we should be doing collaboratively at this stage, and that's where we should be working together globally, is to try to come up with the kind of standards and to talk about the principles that we would want to be in place for us to proceed. But I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that we wait for a global consensus, because I don't think we'll ever get anywhere.
Thank you, Professor Behrens. Mr. Shawsey, would you like to weigh on this?
Yes, so my response is very much going to be seconding a lot of what's been said by my fellow panelists, specifically what Professor Behrens just touched on. Community engagement is important, and as Dr. Alam and Mariki touched on, it has practical utility, as we've seen in the genomics research element. But with that being said, I think it is both politically and practically a bad move to suggest that consensus should be a precondition to the acceptability or the use of a particular technology. We should definitely engage in broader societal discussions for the purposes of, one, educating people. This is an important issue, and that could potentially change the course of humanity, so people should at the very least know about it. The second thing is that societal and community engagement is not just an exercise that we should do for a tick box purpose. We can get meaningful feedback that could give us insights on some of these critical issues that there's no clear academic answers to. And it can also have an important effect of opening up society in order to avoid downstream adverse consequences. So for example, if gene editing is allowed to proceed without people understanding it, knowing about it, and being open to it, children who are born as a result of these technologies face stigma deriving from ignorance, which is something that could have been remedied if people were more educated about it. So there's a lot of benefit from societal engagement, and that's why I think it's important. But I do not think it is a good idea for us to treat societal engagement as a precondition to the acceptability of a technology.
Thank you, Mr. Shawsey. There are two hands up. Miss Mbukazi informed me in the chat that she specifically wants to comment on this issue, so I'm going to give her opportunity first. Ms. Nomfundo Mbukazi.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you to our panel members. I agree with Bongi that public engagement shouldn't be a precondition for, but I feel that community engagement shouldn't target an easy audience, for example, the more educated. It should go deeper than that. We talking about activists, it's the very ground level, that science shouldn't only be reserved for conferences or people who can understand the scientific language. We should go on an exercise of breaking it down so that when we're saying that we're getting consensus on something that people understand, they know about it, and it is open for everyone. That's what I just wanted to add, Professor. As Bongi has just said, is that it shouldn't be a tick box exercise. It should be meaningful engagement with activists, all for a sort of groups that represent society.
Yeah, and I think Professor Behrens also spoke about patient interest groups earlier. Thank you, Ms. Mbukazi. So there are two hands raised. First, Ms. Leroux, and after that, Ms. Nakasatu.
Thank you for another opportunity to be so audacious. So I just have another question to basically dovetail off the discussion we've had now regarding safety. Safe enough. And I think my concern there is, to what degree do we weigh in socio-political safety? If, as Mr. Shorzy pointed out, the fact remains that African humanness is dialogical in nature, and that dialogical philosophy, or the philosophy that informs that dialogical engagement, is in turn informed by the lived realities, or the non-philosophical. So if the material conditions set the tone for what the philosophy should be when considering what we ought to do, my question then is, as the global South, should, or to what extent should we push the agenda for socio-political considerations on the table, and not just restrict safety to the physiological or the evolutionary, seeing as that socio-political ontological denial is what the burden of the global South is. To what degree do we not just fall or accept that we are to conduct our or define safety within a very limited scope? To what degree do we push the boundaries to include and insist upon socio-political factors being predominant in deciding what to do as a global endeavor? Thank you.
It's interesting that in the report that was released about a month ago by the European Group on Ethics of New Technologies, that they specifically suggest that the social safety or social aspects should be included in safety considerations. So I would like to hear the panel's opinions on this, but perhaps I can add a bit more flavor to this question. If we think back about 500 years, when Galileo Galilei wanted to look through his telescope, clearly that caused massive social disruption, even political disruption in the long term. So if there was some committee that had to look, some other ethics committee in the year, I don't know what it was, around about 1500, that had to look at the safety aspects of this telescope and consider the social safety of using this novel technology, I can guarantee you that there would have been consensus that it's not socially or politically safe to do so, and we would still live in a heliocentric world. The same can of course be said of many other technological advances, even of philosophical advances. Say for instance, well, during the Renaissance, if you think of Pico della Mirandola and he and his radical new philosophy that humans do not have a telos, humans don't have a single archetype, but as humans we each can choose our own goals and our own telos, so to speak. And with that, the end, well, that rang the end of the Augustinian and Aristotelian ethical approach in society. So it was no wonder that the Catholic Church at the time banned his work. Although I think for us looking back, you know, living in liberal democracies, what Pico della Mirandola said is now basically commonly accepted wisdom. So that's my small contribution. I would be very, personally, I would be very skeptical to conceptually expand safety to include social safety, because what you're effectively then doing is you're saying that that we like society as it is, and we prefer the status quo, because any technological change has the potential to disrupt the current social status quo. That's my short contribution. I see that the panelists are in deep thought and making themselves ready to provide their inputs.
Before they do, may I ask to just go off what Professor said? By the same rationale, to my mind, that if we are society now where the colonialism should have happened 4 centuries ago, I think the answer would be different than the one you had with Galileo. Scientific racism in itself has disproven itself over and over again. We have a large body of work that condemns sciences that we accepted to be or deemed to be acceptable at the time. So from that perspective, I guess that's kind of where my question stems from, is from to what degree do we erase ontological humanists of certain populations? And to what degree do we accept that some people need to be sacrificed? And who gets to then decide that? What philosophy do we base that on if we can't reach consensus? And yeah, I guess with that being said, I think that in totality sums up the context or the intention behind my question.
And if I may add to that, you have the intention to disrupt. But I don't, well, you want to disrupt ethical thought, but you do not necessarily want to disrupt certain elements in society.
As someone who is in favor of rupture, I don't think rupture means returning to a previous time. I think rupture means going new, novel, humanizing ways forward from where we already find ourselves. And we do have technology. So with the potential, of course, to humanize. I think my question then stems from when we say humanize, who do we include into the scope of considering who is deemed worthy of being humanized? To what degree do we discount certain perspectives and certain lived realities in making that decision? If we're going to localize it to South Africa, we are a breakaway settler colony. To what degree do we take that into consideration when we draft our policies? To what degree does that, being as philosophy is informed by the non-philosophical, to what degree does the material conditions of the majority of people in South Africa who find themselves in living under extreme conditions of precarity and poverty, to what degree does that factor into what we decide as the elite who sit at the table, or at least are fighting to sit at the table of having these discussions, having voices heard, having the privilege to do so? To what degree do we, by falling within the narrow scope of what the global north tells us, this is safety, to what degree do we then perpetuate that denial of the lived reality of those who live under precarity? Yeah.
Good. Well, it has become a very loaded question, clearly. But the question in short, without now laying an egg again from my side, is just the conceptual boundaries of safety. If we say that heritable genome editing needs to be safe enough, what exactly do we mean? Do we refer to medical safety, its current context, or should we fight for a conceptual expansion of safety to something like societal and political safety? So over to the panel. Who would like to go first? Dr. Botha?
Yes, thank you. I think in this circumstance, I agree with Julian's approach, a staggered approach, where the science will dictate what will be able to be implemented into society And once a science is deemed safe enough, you can then establish what the impact would be on a community or society once it's implemented. Because the science will only be implemented into a community when it's deemed safe enough after clinical trials. And then you can establish what is safe enough for the individual, the society, the population, the country. So I think you need to take baby steps in this regard, cautious progress.
Thank you. Dr. Alam?
No, I entirely agree. And just to point out that even at the scientific level, there are different levels of safety even within clinical trials, right? We have efficacy trials, and we have level 2 trials, level 2B trials. So it is a stepwise process, and some of them actually look at safety per se itself, and the other arm, obviously, of if we're thinking of genomic medicine or gene editing, obviously the outcome is a positive impact on health or whatever that is. So the other question is not only is it safe, but also how effective is it, right? Can we still get the same level of effectiveness by combining 2 different drug treatments or 2 different methods of treatment? So I think, it is a stepwise process, but safety comes into two forms, so to speak.
Professor Behrens, social safety, political safety?
Almost want to claim the Fifth Amendment here. So safety, I'm a bit worried about the ways in which the word is currently being broadened beyond its original sort of physical safety context. And I'm concerned about the way in which it's often now being used almost as a way of fencing off certain ideas which are regarded as untouchable from conflicting or different views. So people are talking about, give me a safe space, and everything needs to be a safe space in which nobody confronts me because I am entitled to my views because they are part of my nature and my being and my history and my experience. And so anyone who now comes up and says anything contrary to that is somehow harming me. And that harm therefore means that I mustn't be open to other ideas. And I think that goes completely contrary to what the whole academic project is about, and what science is about. So I do worry about using that language. At the same time, I do think we have to take seriously into account the effect that it has on societies and different societies and what these decisions will have. But I don't think that's the same thing as talking about expanding safety to mean things other than its original sense.
I think that is very clear. Mr. Shorzy?
The only thing I would add is that I think in the discourse of safety, it's important for us to make certain conceptual distinctions. One of them is when we talk about safety in a scientific context or technical context. In that sense, safety is a scientific question, and there's no real space for sort of questions of a so-called social safety, because that's not really a scientific inquiry. If, however, we're thinking about social safety as really meaning thinking about the implications this will have on society at large, I think that there is space for that, but I also think that questions of safety are inherently associated with the idea of risk. And the way we assess risk in society for good reason is always something that comes back to evidence. So I have patience for and space for discussions about social consequences that we can think about in empirical terms. So, for example, thinking about the psychological impact of being gene edited in a society that doesn't accept gene editing. That's something we can discuss, and that's something we can do something about. But there's more abstract questions that can get caught up in conversations about social safety that I think are problematic precisely because we can never make a determination or give weight to how real of a risk is this. It's essentially postulation. So if you want to talk about, for example, the political consequences of allowing CRISPR to be used in practice, I don't know that there's any methodology that could bring us to a conclusion where we can make a determination about that kind of thing. And so I understand people's concerns about it, but whether it should be a part of the decision-making process, I'm not entirely convinced.
Thank you. Over to Kate Nakasatu.
Yes, thank you for the presentations and the discussions. I'm from Osaka University in Japan, and I have a question regarding the African or perspectives of the African philosophy on some of the social issues of genome editing. I think in a lot of international discourse, there's been mentions of issues such as equity or equality or non-discrimination. So then considering the emphasis on, I guess, community in the African philosophy, I wonder what the panelists' opinions are on how to address issues like these, specifically in terms of equitable access to medical care or medical technology, or unequal literacy levels that may inhibit public or community engagement in the discourse, or, for example, discussions on non-discrimination, that technology such as this may increase stigmatization towards people who already have disabilities or disease. That's a lot of questions, but if you could
That's an
answer.
excellent question indeed. And I think it flows also from what Professor Behrens touched on in his presentation. The question is about equity. That is, of course, a concern. And what is the solution? Can we perhaps start with Professor Behrens? Any possible solutions to the equity concerns?
There we go again with solutions. Yes, these are always the hardest questions. As we know where we should go, but how do we get there? And in fact, it's quite interesting, Kate, that I had in fact had on my slide originally as one of the other ethical issues, some of the issues that have been raised by disabled people and concerns, for instance, about, are we now saying that people with Down syndrome should be eradicated, that there's something wrong with them? Is that what this will ultimately lead to? And I do think, I mean, that's exactly, I think, the reason that going back to what I said right at the beginning, we need to be doing this in a global way and discussing this and hearing the voices of for instance, people who are disabled and others as we have these discussions. And it does concern me that so many of these discussions, it's usually a bunch of white men who are scientists largely, and then a smattering of ethicists and legal people thrown in, and that's about it. And really, we really do need to be engaging more broadly. And equity is never going to be reached unless those who are likely to be left out get the chance to say something.
Dr. Boertes?
No, I fully agree. Equity is something difficult, and it depends on where you look at with regards to equity. Do you look at access to these technologies, the implementation of the technologies, and the consequence of the technologies? So from a South African perspective, access to medical care is, as I said in my talk, is something that prohibits a lot of people from gaining critical care for something like TB, which is completely curable, but they simply don't have the funds or the access or the means to get it. So that is only accessing the technologies, as opposed to the consequence of the technology thereafter. But equity can also be, and that's to the secondary part of your long question, can also speak to education. because equity after the implementation of these technologies will speak to stuff like discrimination and enhancement and acceptance of certain people, edited versus unedited, the haves versus the not haves, which is so common in the world in any event. And you can fix that or not fix it, but educate people. And it seems so simple to tell that we must educate people, we must engage the public. But how do you do that? First of all, you need to know exactly who you need to educate with and what means of education will suit them the best. So you need to, first of all, make that human connection because you want to connect with humans. And that speaks to the whole entire consent debate. How do you, and I agree that consent is not a tick box, by no means. Consent is the entire process. And I want to dare to say that consent is a relationship you build between parties in the consent process, because that relationship will ultimately lead to trust. Trust will ultimately lead to understanding that hopefully will eradicate discrimination or isolation or uninformedness, which will ultimately hopefully lead to equity or equality or acceptance. It's a loaded answer for a loaded question, but yes, that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boertes. Over to Dr. Alam.
Yeah, so I entirely agree with what has been said so far, right? We need to listen to as many voices as we can. And then obviously there's this critical piece of engagement and education, but at the expense of sounding like a broken record, especially in the African context, what I'd add to it that, you know, these are so-called our problems, our issues, they're unique to Africa. You know, we've talked about TBs and HIVs, sickle cells. Who are the people who are most affected by them? Who are the people who most intimately understand them? Who are the people who are most impacted by them? It's us. And if it's us, then we should lead and set the agenda for what the solutions would look like or what our needs are. And, you know, and I think the important thing about that is not only access, but it's also sustainability, right? And uptake. We've had cases where we've gone and, you know, said, okay, there's not been equity or there hasn't been, you know, access. And once it's provided, there hasn't been uptake, right? So an example of that is around COVID vaccines, right? There's been this big thing that Africa has not had enough vaccines. You know, there were countries that made them available, and then there was hesitancy around it. There was a lack of uptake. So I think it's the entire cycle, but it's being in charge of our solutions and our issues.
Thank you. Something that I was thinking of in South Africa, for instance, is that we're moving towards the so-called national health insurance, which would be a general public health insurance for all citizens of South Africa. So there can, of course, be, well, there is the possibility that something like genetic editing can then be funded by the national health insurance, which should, in theory, make it more accessible and which should, in theory, provide access to everybody who is interested in accessing that specific health service. But over to Mr. Shawsey.
Well, I mean, you kind of took the words out of my mouth, don't you? As you know, in my own work, I'm
sorry.
It's fine. But sort of, I completely agree with the other panelists, but sort of, if we look at how to respond to the social issues in a more practical context, my argument has always been that, are there concerns about what we might describe as social threats? Absolutely. But I do not think that those social threats should be seen as reasons for us to prohibit people having access to this technology, because there are people with arguably very compelling justifications for wanting to make use of germline genome editing. So we should then think about, okay, practically, how do we respond to these social threats to avoid these adverse social outcomes? Well, firstly, we need to think about questions relating to gene editing in a contextual way, which I'm very glad has generally been the tone of the entire discussion, where people are sensitive to the fact that we need to, in that South African context, for example, think about the problems South Africa faces, and then think about the risks those pose and how do we attend to those specific risks. And then the second step of that would be, how do we think about practical solutions? So relating to, for example, the equity issue, I've argued that if we're really concerned about people not having access to this technology, and more importantly, we think that they should, because just because people don't have access doesn't necessarily mean they should have access, but that's a separate issue. But if we think that they should, then that's something we can take practical steps towards with something like a national system that finances access. And it's something we actually do with certain technologies. So for example, genetic testing for pregnant mothers is something that the state has financed for about 6 or 7 years now, to screen for things like trisomy 21 and other serious genetic conditions. So if we think gene editing as an intervention is a way we can solve issues like our HIV problem, then that's something we can remedy by saying the state should support it. As to other social issues like lack of access to people really knowing and understanding gene editing, again, that's something that we can solve if we think that it's a sufficiently serious issue by engaging with people, by in the process of social discourse, not just having it be a conversation about this particular technology, but also being a thing about promoting scientific literacy generally, which I think is something that's very important within the South African context. So generally, my response to the issue of social problems is that we need to think contextually in order to predict them, and we need to think about concrete solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Shorzy. I see in the chats that Ms. Jennifer Marchant indicated, well, she drew everybody's attention to ARIJ, the international association that focuses on the regulation of gene editing, and membership is open to anybody anywhere in the world, either as an individual or as a corporate body, such as a university research group. And well, my research group is a proud member, so I can definitely encourage everybody present to go to the ARIJ website and read what they are all about. And I would encourage you to join as members of ARIJ. That may be an important step to ensuring that your voice and African voices generally are heard in an international forum. Ms. Marchand has her hand raised. You're very welcome to comment.
I want to thank you very, very profusely for drawing everybody's attention to ARIJ. We are I know that Professor Shorzy is a candidate. We have upcoming elections. So these are our first board elections, and we are very, we do everything ourselves. We don't have a lot of funding. We don't have any funding except for the dues, but we are still growing. And our membership is more, our philosophy, if you will, since we're talking about philosophy, is one that is trying to move away from the sort of hegemonic Anglo-American individualistic approach to ethical issues surrounding not only human genome editing. We're also working on, we also have quite a few members who are working in the field of crop engineering and gene drive, etc. And we're very pleased to have members from South America and from various countries in Africa. And we, unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to meet this year in person, but next year is going to be a better year for all. And I really think that our approach is important. And I think it's important, again, as I mentioned in the email, to move away from this sort of hegemonic Anglo-American approach to these issues. And I don't know who said it earlier. I think most of the time these reports that come out, the WHO report is coming out pretty soon, are gather specialists, experts, generally white men, scientists, and our profile, our composition is much more diverse than that, and we are looking at issues that are from an international, global, and more or less global South perspective. So we need to become bigger and stronger, and we need to we're going to be hiring a communication specialist soon because we're doing everything ourselves. Our website isn't very modern or what have you, but we're getting somewhere, we're getting there. And our hope is to really be heard by regulators and decision makers and policy makers in the very short term. So thank you for drawing attention to Arish. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think Arish certainly has a very important role to play going forward. Dr. Alam?
Yeah, if I may, could I ask a question to the panel?
You're very welcome.
Because I've never actually had this opportunity to engage with this level of thinking. I've just always thought of it from a very different level. And so please excuse me if this comes across as, very naive, but it's actually coming from a place of curiosity, right? So in the scientific world, so to speak, right, there are two forms of gene editing that have been going on for ages that still have, the same issues that we have discussed today, right? It's individual choice. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, negative or positive. Usually the outcome is, few generations down. It's not equitable. It's people the rich who have a choice who can go do it. It's linked to, knowledgeable. And these two forms are one, the whole idea around the microbiome. So we know the microbiome, literally turns off genes. And not only that, it also integrates into a mother's genetic DNA, and then it's transferred, right? And there's this whole piece where, women choose to eat certain foods, increase certain microbiomes. Classical example of this is within irritable bowel disease. Same concept, but it's not raised such a reaction. And then the other one, the one that's been there for ages and that actually has contributed to Africa's genetic diversity, so to speak, is our exposures to viruses. And that's what HIV is, right? Viruses only work by integrating into the germline and then are transmitted. And in fact, for years, there were all these pieces of DNA in human genome that we called nonsense genes because we thought they didn't code for anything. And it's just now that we're understanding that they have, or junk DNA, that they have some meaning. And again, these were choices and exposures and, outcomes further down the line and, changing future generations. So from a philosophical or ethical understanding, like what drives these differences? Or is there something that we can learn from there to apply, something that's raising, I should say, more of a negative reaction in us, if that makes sense?
Since that is a very difficult question, I think Professor Behrens should be the first to answer that.
I don't know.
I got lost somewhere there, so I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
Shall I attempt to
please
to summarize, or did one of the other panel members grasp it more clearly? Mrs. Shawsey, you have your hand raised.
If I may, Dr. Alam's question is essentially pointing out a very important thing, and I'm glad you raised this issue, namely that gene editing using a technology like CRISPR is novel. However, there are various ways in which humans have been influencing their genomes and the genetic characteristics they pass on for generations. And Professor Alam references specific recent sort of technological interventions. For example, we've discovered that viruses contribute to our genomes while alive, and some of those pieces of DNA is passed on to future generations. But if you think about it more broadly, human beings have been controlling how we pass on genetic material in a number of ways. For example, something as simple as how we select mates. That is, in a sense, a way in which we are controlling the genetic composition of our future generations. So if you, in modern times, use a sperm donor, that you choose a sperm donor with a specific height and a specific educational background, that is very similar to what we think of in gene editing, that you're making these decisions, you're taking actions that can impact the genetic composition of your prospective child. And I think Dr. Alam wanted insights on how gene editing is specifically, I guess, ethically exceptional and seems to warrant more alarm from many people, considering the fact that there's all these other ways in which we intervene in the human genome.
And also environmental influences like viruses and so on, that can. But you've now clarified the question. Would you like to venture an answer?
So I am on record as actually raising the same issue myself to make an important point, which is that we often think of the human genome because of certain events in our history as something very special. And this is a direct product, I think, especially of the genetic revolution in the late 90s and early 2000s with the Human Genome Project. And this idea that the genome is essentially, the secret to who you are. And this idea has been very influential in our society. It's why things like 23andMe have been so successful, because people think of their genomes and genetic information as holding the keys to the essence of the human condition, which is why some scholars have argued that the human genome in contemporary society is almost a secular version of the soul in terms of how people think about it. But that idea is challenged by the frank reality that intervening into our genomes and the products of our genomes isn't something stable or constant. In fact, throughout your life, there are various things that impact on your own genetic composition, and some of those things can be passed on to future generations. So thinking of the human genome as a singular thing is somewhat deceptive in that it creates a false impression in your mind about what genomes are and how DNA functions. And so there are certain ethical issues that are unique to germline gene editing, most notably the fact that it is a very specific and targeted way of controlling the genetic compositions of our future generations. But it's important that we not think of it as something alien and something so far removed from what humans have been doing for many generations. It's simply the next evolution of it. And I think the only extent to which it warrants, I think, an extra level of consideration is not because it allows us to do something new, but it allows us a level of control in doing it that is unprecedented.
Indeed, indeed. Professor Behrens, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think what's really being put before us here is exactly the kind of thing that philosophers like to do, and that is to try to come up with exactly what these distinctions are, and that is kind of the task before us. And I think that work is being done on it. I'm not current with all of it, but I think that is exactly the kind of question that we need to be dealing with now. Why are we exceptionalizing this form of gene editing? Why is it any more scary than the fact that the royal households of Europe intermarried for how long, and now they're marrying commoners, and they're putting all of their what I've heard of once called Hanoverian munchkin genes into the broad pool, and so I think, that's exactly the kind of thing that does need more work from philosophers, and yeah, more direct focus, I guess. I don't have any good answers to that question yet because I haven't thought about it that much.
So,
and even if I do think about it, there's no guarantee that I'll ever have any really good answers to. Some questions I just stop asking and work on others.
Well, but perhaps it creates some perspective, So perhaps I must ask Dr. Botha, as you've mentioned. Well, I know you've got two handsome young teenage boys. So and I'm sure you didn't just decide to marry any gentleman to become their father. I'm sure your husband had to comply with a whole set of criteria. So does that mean that your teenagers are designer children?
Oh, hell no.
But from some perspective, they
are fabulously normal.
From some perspective,
they might be, but the irony is I married an extremely sporty guy. He's like a Jack Russell. Anything rounds, he goes after it. And the irony is that my children does not do any form of sport. So that boomeranged horrendously on me.
But
So
as Mr. Shawsey pointed out, it doesn't mean that you didn't that you didn't desire to design them. It simply means that with the technology that's improving, you didn't have sufficient precise means at your disposal. So as technology is improving with CRISPR-Cas9, in future generations, our technology might just allow us to determine these things more accurately.
That's true. That's true. But I must tell you, when you first meet the person you wish to marry, that is the furthest from your mind. I often find that people hardly ever think about or poses the question that, do you want to have children? How many children do you want to have? So I don't think people necessarily meet each other with a view of, aha, you look like a good fit, you're tall enough, you're muscular enough, or whatever the case may be. And I think it boils down to free will. And just in addition to Dr. Allen's question is, people, if you look not only at philosophy, but also at history, people has always feared new medical interventions, from the first blood transfusion that was prohibited by fellow colleagues of, I can't remember the medical practitioner's name. It was prohibited, so he tested it on himself. And it goes on for the development of vaccines and numerous other medical technologies. People fear what they don't know. And that is the essence of science and scientific research. You are examining the unknown. And I think in the age of communication, where we disseminate so much information, be it fake information or true information, is just so easy to get information. That we just know about all these scientific developments. And that scares a lot of people because they need to control it. They need to have certainty. And that's exactly what science cannot do. You dabble into the unknown and you hope for the best. And if something fabulous comes out on the other end, that's great. That's what every scientist aims for, isn't it? But in the information age, every single last piece of information is being leaked out, be it on Facebook or reputable media agencies, whatever. And somewhere in this tsunami of information, you must discern yourself whether the science is moving in the correct direction, according to my set of values, or is it not? Is it something I will use? Is it something I will not use? So it becomes complicated to the extent, go back to the science, which you can control, go back to the numbers and make sure that you communicate correctly. Because another thing that was so predominant during the COVID-19 pandemic was the wave of fake news that still scares people into vaccine hesitancy. How do you stop fake news? And fake news, from a psychological point of view, they established as people are conjuring up these ghosts almost because they don't know and they can't control. They feel out of control, so they just believe the scary stories because they don't need to engage in this science or scientific technologies, and that will keep them safe. So it's a very intricate scenario, and that's why I said previously, we need to start stepwise. Start with the science. Let the science dictate what we communicate, and let the communication then dictate what is best for societies after we engage them, and according to their values, they decided whether it's acceptable or not. But the science must back that up first. So that's my, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Boertes. Mr. Shawsey had his hand up. So the last word will go to you.
The last word will be a question, so hopefully someone will complete that word by answering it. Specifically for Dr. Alla, you raised an important point, and that's how we regulate genomic and genetics research in the African continent. I think the work you and your various organizations are doing is exceptional and much needed. You raised a very specific question regarding the controversial issue of consent. When you're dealing with African populations, this is a very delicate issue because of this big question of whether we deal with these communities as individuals or whether we factor into account the fact that they are communities and have this communal identity. You've been critical of broad consent. But I would like your opinion then, and the alternative to broad consent. How should the consent issue be regulated in the African context regards to consent?
Wow, that's a tough one. So
Very interesting.
yeah, I mean, and I think really important, right? Because that's what we were arguing, that we cannot necessarily apply consent the way it applies in the Western world or in other communities to our African societies. We have to appreciate right from the beginning the uniqueness of what these communities mean. So I think that's why the idea, that the framework that we put forward was that it's just not a one-time consent, and it's just not it's not a general consent, and that's what came out in the biospecimen governance. It's not broad consent, and it's not time limited, so it's constant engagement. So there's consent again linked to the different levels. So I think, and obviously when we talk about consent, and you've brought a very important thing, it's also about buy-in. Right, so it's about buy-in and it's about knowledge, and that comes from community public engagement. And that's why within the framework that we are sort of putting forward is that, these three things are not standalone, they work hand in hand. You need them all. You need to start with the engagement piece, the knowledge building. We've seen there's a big gap in that, build this trust, understand the context, and then design. So it's about co-creation. So I think that's a short answer to a very tough question, but I'd love to connect with you after this if you've got bigger ideas for us.
Yeah, well, South Africa is
actually everyone on this panel for sure.
Well, currently the Academy of Science of South Africa is driving an effort to develop a code of conduct in terms of our privacy legislation for research. So the issue of research participant consent is, of course, at the center of that. But I will engage with you in after the meeting regarding that. I just to conclude, I think it's important to just put your answer in context, because we discussed various issues regarding public consent and so on. So your position regarding consent that you've now discussed is regarding research participant consent to research. Am I correct?
Actually, we've looked at it in the context of research and clinical trials. Okay. So not necessarily in context of treatment or
but it's about participant consent to being part of such a study.
Yes.
Okay. Because I just wanted to differentiate it from our previous discussion that we had about broad public engagement about doing certain research. That is, of course, then something different.
I guess the same framework applies, right? Because it's again about understanding. It's about buy-in. It's about understanding context. It's about knowledge building. It's about trust. So I think it's the understanding and the application. But we discussed it in the context of research and clinical trials. Yes.
Good. I think we've already gone over time, and it's such an interesting colloquium. I think we can go on for another 3 hours, but we will rather save that for another colloquium. So everyone, I want to extend another word of thanks, gratitude to our panelists who were in the firing line and who answered all of the difficult questions. Thank you for your great presentations and for answering all of the questions. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for everyone who participated and made this such an interesting and engaging colloquium. So I bid you farewell, and I hope that you have a great day further. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone.
Bye.